his novel, A Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens describes Scrooge finding the ghost of Christmas present surrounded by turkeys, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, suckling pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red hot chestnuts, and all other sorts of festive food. But that novel was published in 1843, 30 years after Pride and Prejudice. So is there any evidence that Jane Austen would have eaten anything different at Christmas? According to thebathmagazine.co.uk, punch and mulled wine was infused with hot apples, sugar and spices. Perhaps that's the forerunner of what we call mulled wine today. They did have mince pies. They still contain beef, or sometimes tongue, could be ox tongue perhaps. And in fact, a few days after Jane Austen's 18th birthday, a newspaper advert tells us that a Mr. T. Ware, a confectioner, grocer and tea dealer from Manchester, was selling ready-made mince pies in 1793. Having engaged a person from London in the confectionery and pastry line, mince pies may be had fresh every day for the season, likewise confectionery, pickles, etc. of the very best quality and flavour. That was just after Jane Austen turned 18, but unlike our modern circular mince pies, Georgian ones could be rather more elaborate. Often they were shaped like a cradle to reflect the manger that Jesus would have been put in the nativity scenes. And mince pies, strangely enough, also get a mention in Pride and Prejudice quite early on in the novel. Mr. Bingley initially moves into his new home at Netherfield Park by Michaelmas, which is the 29th of September. It's totally normal that he would begin a tenancy on one of the old quarter days, but that's another subject. Now, by one calculation, Jane Bennet is invited to have dinner with Mr. Bingley's two sisters on the 12th of November, and her mother schemes to send her on horseback instead of allowing her to take the carriage, which she could quite easily have done. Jane gets rained on, she gets a cold, and oh dear, she has to stay at Netherfield a little longer with Mr. Bingley and his sisters. Not so subtle Mrs. Bennet there. Before Jane leaves, Mrs. Bennet, of course, seizes the chance to call at Netherfield, apparently to see her unwell daughter, but actually it allows her to be a little bit nosy, and in doing so she also manages to openly criticise the very wealthy Mr. Darcy, who would be a multi-millionaire by today's standards. Not necessarily a good idea. But her daughter Elizabeth tries to divert the conversation away from Mrs. Bennet's barbs by asking after her friend Charlotte Lucas. Here, Mrs. Bennet makes another not so subtle attempt to show how much better her daughters are than her neighbours. Charlotte, she says, called yesterday with her father. What an agreeable man he is. Another dig at Darcy, who understandably does not want to talk to Mrs. Bennet, so is sitting very quietly elsewhere in the room. And although Charlotte and Sir William visited, they did not stay for dinner. Cue Mrs. Bennet's very catty comment, "I fancy Charlotte was wanted at home about the mince pies. For my part, Mr. Bingley, I always keep servants that can do their own work. My daughters are brought up differently." You really couldn't make this up, could you? Mrs. Bennet has no evidence at all that Charlotte is going home to help out with the mince pies. She's just so eager to get her daughters married off that she is putting other single women in the neighbourhood down on the strength of how involved they might be in their household's pre-Christmas preparations. Meanwhile, plum pudding was such a staple of Christmas dinner that when a very rich man named Mr. Wright died in Oxford, the Derby Mercury of the 12th of January 1786 noted that he was so careful with his money that on Christmas Day he prohibited his housekeeper from making a plum pudding, which he inveighed against as being a luxury. A luxury. Estimates of Mr. Wright's personal wealth varied between £100,000 and £500,000, and that's in 1786. I'm sure Mr. Wright could most definitely have afforded a Christmas pudding. There are two extracts from the Hampshire Chronicle that show that the royal family, at the time when Jane Austen was still a small child, offered a really good example of how those who could afford to might help the less fortunate at Christmas. And in fact, this first report dates from the 1st of January 1776, which is about 2 weeks after Jane Austen was born. The Duke and Duchess of Cumberland gave orders for the neighbourhood poor at Windsor Lodge to be entertained for 3 days of the holiday with beef and plum puddings and mince pies, all those traditional Christmas staples, and likewise for 100 guineas, which is a colossal amount of money, to be distributed amongst the distressed families. Now, the Duke of Cumberland was actually Prince Henry, the Duke of Cumberland and Strathearn, to give him his full title. He was the younger brother of King George III. So it's perhaps unsurprising that a few years later we found a further report showing that in 1800, again in the Hampshire Chronicle, King George himself made a similar gesture. 70 poor families in the vicinity of Windsor, once again, on Christmas Day were supplied by order of His Majesty with 3 pounds of meat, potatoes and soup, sufficient for them. There is lots of evidence that this charitable royal example was copied by others further down the social scale, including Jane Austen's own family, which is perhaps unsurprising considering that her father was a rector. Her own letters tell us that on the 26th of December 1798, when she is at home at Steventon, I have given a pair of worsted stockings to Mary Hutchins, Dame Q, Mary Stevens and Dame Staples, a shift to Hannah Staples and a shawl to Betty Dawkins. So this is actually about 2 years before her father, the Reverend George Austen, decided to retire, so we can imagine that these women were probably his parishioners. If we move forward to the Sunday the 29th of November 1812, which means the calendar is exactly synchronised with 2020. She writes to her friend Martha Lloyd, "We are just beginning to be engaged in another Christmas duty, and a very pleasant one, next to eating turkeys. Laying out Edward's money for the poor." She's referring here to her third eldest brother, Edward Austen, who was adopted by a childless distant cousin, Thomas Knight, when he was about 17 years old, and ended up inheriting 3 different properties from him. Edward changed his name to Knight, and the 1841 census describes him as being of independent means. By 1851 he was an esquire, a gentleman. So we can imagine that he was definitely in a position to be generous to the poor. And again, being the children of a clergyman, it is totally logical that Edward, Jane and the other Austen siblings would have grown up with a keen awareness that Christmas was a time for charity. Meanwhile, in Durham, even the prisoners were not forgotten. R. Burden, MP, paid £9 12 shillings and 6 in 1800 to Mr. Wolfe, the keeper of the jail and the House of Correction in Durham, to be spent on making soup for the 77 prisoners. That's a lot of soup. And in addition, Mr. Burden and his wife give 10 guineas to provide the industrious poor of Durham with potatoes, soup and rice, which is surprising. I didn't think rice was a common part of the diet but at this point in time, but obviously it was. In 1804, the Chester Courant advertised a sermon which was being given in aid of the Lying In charity. It notes that we hope for the credit of our fellow citizens and the cause of suffering humanity that the liberal and benevolent will attend on this occasion. In other words, don't come unless you're willing to put your hand in your pocket for charity. The sermon would be given at 6:30 p.m. on Christmas Day by the Reverend Ebenezer White, and it was going to feature pieces from Handel's Messiah. The Messiah was composed in 1741, so I suppose it would be the equivalent of us in 2020 having a Christmas concert featuring Elvis's Christmas album from 1957, for instance. It was explained that the charity was set up to allow new mothers to stay in their own homes when they were ready to give birth, rather than having to go to a hospital or workhouse. So it's trying to offer them the more middle class luxury, I suppose, that they might not have otherwise been able to enjoy. If we move back towards the other end of the social scale again, in 1809, at Stamford Hall in Staffordshire, the home of the Earl of Stamford, roast beef, plum pudding and strong beer, again those traditional Christmas favourites, were laid on for everyone, rich or poor. This is the Christmas of 1808. The Earl even opened up his plate rooms for a general exhibition at this season, so that visitors could marvel at a superabundance of old mussy plate that no other mansion in England could boast of. I had never heard of mussy plate before until I came across this extract, but it turns out that mussy or massy plate is bulky or heavy silver plated items, so a huge display of it would have looked really impressive. You can imagine it filling this bookshelf here and then some. It would have been quite something to see, and very shiny. So effectively, what the Earl is doing here is a little bit like allowing people to go and look round a stately home today, except that you were getting your dinner thrown in for free instead of having to buy it yourself. So there's a little bit about food and charity and all the enjoyable sides of Christmas that were open to the community in Jane Austen's lifetime or thereabouts. Now in the next video of this series, the final video, I will be looking at perhaps the most fundamental thing to do with Christmas of all, other than the religious side. We'll be looking at gifts and what they might have consisted of in a typical Regency Christmas. So thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you again for the next video.